Thank you, Klaus. And thank you not least for getting me out of the office in Shantiniketan on this beautiful, beautiful afternoon here in Delhi. Anyway, I've probably got the most invisible hat this afternoon. Many of you may not have heard of the European Investment Bank. The clue is obviously in the name. We are one of the European institutions. It's our 60th birthday this year, so almost as old as I am. We're the financing arm of the European Union. Something that most people don't know about us is that we're actually the largest multilateral financier in the world. We're actually 5 times bigger than the World Bank. So that means we're involved in just about every single large infrastructure project in Europe, including smart cities. And that's why we have an opinion about what smart cities are, and what makes good smart city projects, and what makes bad smart city projects. And that's really what I wanted to talk a little bit about this afternoon. The second word in our title is investment. And people, when they think about bankers and investment, the investment is usually for some kind of financial return. Well, our organization is a not-for-profit, so it's not for returns. But what it is for is a very simple phrase: sustainable economic growth and integration. And that's both inside Europe and outside Europe. And we see smart cities as being fundamental to that growth. I'll come back to that in just a second. Here in India, our focus is, our mandate is really around climate change. So at the moment we have a portfolio of about 2 billion euros. Half of that is in urban transport, in Lucknow Metro and in Bangalore Metro. And we have a couple of other metros coming up fairly soon. And the other half is in renewable energy. So in large-scale grid-connected solar, but perhaps more importantly in distributed solar applications. What I think we're bringing to the table in this afternoon's discussion is the fact that we know how to mobilize private sector finance to support all of these initiatives. And that's a very tricky thing. Obviously, we lend in certain cases to governments and support their public sector investment. But actually finding ways to encourage private sector to invest in projects is the key to addressing the scale of the problem and the pace of investment that's really required. So, as I mentioned, we're a self-funding organization. Each year we tap the international capital markets for about 65 billion euros worth, so just a little over $70 billion. And we reinvest that. In fact, we reinvest about 80 billion every year. And more than 2/3 of that goes towards supporting private sector projects. And we work with the private sector by part financing the private sector. So we provide part of the contribution, the private sector put the other contribution, and that's what we call leverage. So typically we put in 50% of the financing requirements and the private sector put in the other 50%. That's already doubling the leverage there. And the third aspect of the mobilizing the private sector finance is actually that it's debt finance, it's not grant finance. And some people see that as an issue. They would prefer to have grant finance. But in fact, we see debt finance as a very important model because it's revolving. As people pay back those loans, we're able to redisperse that money. So that's a very important part of mobilizing the private sector. Now, the EIB's policy for smart city investments, we obviously have a fairly limited pool of money in India. 2 billion is nothing compared to what India needs. So we're very selective in our investment profile. So we're looking for 3 things in smart city projects. And we've formulated a smart city policy, and the 3 words are innovative. And that's what I heard this morning. It's all about technology, ITC. The second is something that one of my panel colleagues talked about this morning, was integration. Integration is the second word. So it's no longer single vertical solutions, it's about how these solutions work together. And the third, which perhaps touches on what Nina was talking about earlier, and I think is a very important thing, is inclusivity. That many of the needs that the problems the cities are facing these days are not just large-scale transport infrastructure or how to distribute power or distribute water, but they're actually to address the needs of a population that is changing, a population that is perhaps aging or very young, uneducated, that has recently come from the rural communities. So we see that inclusivity as a very important part of our selection process. Why do we see cities as important to sustainable development? Well, as I understand, by 2050, 70% of the world's population will be in cities. Cities now already contribute 70% of the global GDP. So they are fundamental to the economic development of the countries. I mentioned some of the challenges that we face or cities are facing. From the EIB point of view in India, we see climate change as one of the most important aspects of those cities. Resilience to flooding and all the other events, but also greening the cities, I think, as one of my panel colleagues talked about here. And more in this kind of world, if I may just diverse, where things are changing, you know, there's a lot of social tension here, and there are a lot of excluded communities. And cities can work to bring those, include those excluded communities. And I think that's a very important part of the investment cycle. So, as I was saying, smart cities for us are fundamental to sustainable development. And the 3 points are integration. We look for an integrated planning framework when we're looking at this. So it's no longer just a power project or a transport project, but it's the integration of water, waste, and all of the other aspects. And it has to be planning-led. So it needs to be within a clearly well-understood framework. The second point is inclusivity. And inclusivity means not just that public services are made available, and a smaller point, here for us smart city investments includes ICT investments which make public services available through the internet, through technology to the people. So helping develop responsive city administrations which address the needs of the entire city population. The second point about inclusivity is in the development of these integrated planning frameworks, that there should be a very clear consultative process. And I think that consultation is something that we're looking for. And finally, the point which I understand the audience is largely technical, but so this is all very familiar, but it should be innovative. But not just innovative in terms of distributed power generation and so on. We're also looking at distributed healthcare, social services, the electrification of the vehicle fleet, which I think is highly relevant in polluted cities like Delhi. Looking at innovating our fairly traditional smart city sectors such as urban transport and water. So just looking back at the EIB's experience in smart city investments, what we see are a number of very clear, good characteristics to the projects. The first is that there's a planned investment cycle using a multi-sector strategy. So this is typically public sector led. For us, there should be a clear progression of the investments, a clear scaling of the investments, and a clear methodology to attracting the right quality investment partners and the right markets. There are ways of, through green bonds and so on, of attracting the right types of finance. The second point is we see that cities that understand their comparative advantages do very well. And those comparative advantages can be in human capital, natural resources, or they're already existing infrastructure assets. But they have to be able to take those existing advantages and build upon them. The third aspect, as I mentioned, is the consultation and the engagement with the citizens and the stakeholders, and particularly in making the investment decisions. The fourth point is the focus on transformation through technology. Not simply the application of technology, but the benefits that the technology can bring. And the final point is something that you were mentioning, is that fostering those cities which foster an environment of innovation prove to us to be very, very successful. And I think those are the characteristics that we've seen in European cities that I think are directly translatable to India.